Since I attend a small church plant in East Austin, I didn't feel like it would be natural or appropriate to record any aspect of the worship service, as it would be relatively noticeable. But I did want to share some examples of what is presented in a call to worship, what people bring to share with our community, where they are either expressing a need for worship or a need that they have in their lives that they long for God to meet, or an encounter with God where that just makes them want to worship God for who He is or what He's done in their lives or through Scripture that just resonates with us as a community. And some of these I contributed, but most I did not, and I'm not going to necessarily clarify which were mine and which weren't, because it doesn't necessarily matter. But yeah, there are several examples, and these are just a few of the ones that I remember clearly. So one comes from the book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8, where it talks about how we are to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And this really was an expression for a need to worship, in the sense of, God, these are things that I don't necessarily understand what that looks like. And I want you to teach me so that I can follow you more closely or really live into what Scripture is calling me to do. And I'm using this language as in just to make it easier to understand. And so again, really concrete, like these are things that we as a community can learn about. Like, what does it mean to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly? It seems like it would make sense, but it's a verse that we hear a lot. But living that out tangibly, practically, is an area for learning, and therefore a need that God can meet us in teaching and encouragement and different things like that. Another example is from the book of Matthew, where Jesus walks on water. I believe it's chapter 14. And this was in conjunction with the book Present Over Perfect by Shauna Niequist. And in this chapter where she addresses this story from Scripture, she talks about how she's always read this story from a lens of shame, and how she would always immediately focus on the rebuke that Jesus gives Peter, where he's like, why did you doubt? Why do you have little faith? And how when she would approach God with prayer, it was always from an element of like, I know I did this wrong. I know I need to do this better. Like, don't shame me. Don't shame me. Like, don't ask why I doubt, why I have little faith. And then suddenly she read this story and she noticed that the rebuke of Peter came after the rescue. That Peter steps out of the boat, he starts to walk on water, and then he starts to sink. And Jesus immediately reaches out and grabs Peter and pulls him out of the water. He doesn't just let him flounder and drown while rebuking, like asking him, why do you doubt? Why do you have little faith? He immediately rescues. And so this changes the tone of the conversation, at least for Shauna and for the person who shared. And thinking through, like, okay, if Jesus immediately rescues, then the conversation afterward is like, what happened? Like, how can I walk with you to do this different? Which is a really powerful shift in focus. So it's not necessarily a lens of shame, but a lens of like, we're in this together. Another example came from the book of Matthew, where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he talks about whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And really thinking through this lens of like how our faith calls us to do things backwards. This idea of what does it mean to even lose our life for God in order to find it. And so this was really also like a need for God to step in, and like a prayer that we would become a people who would hold loosely to our life, who would be willing to lose our lives to actually find the life that God has for us, that we wouldn't grasp so tightly to the life that we want, that we strive for, but that God's purpose would become more important, and that we'd be willing to lose our dreams or goals or whatever in order to live into like the purpose that God has. Another example actually is where two people could have shared about the same story, because sometimes more than one person will contribute to the call of worship. And so it was during the Advent season, and we were talking about various stories surrounding the birth of Jesus. We were in the book of Luke, and we were talking about when the angel appears to Zechariah and tells him that his wife, who's been barren their entire marriage, is going to have a kid. And they're both older in years. It seems impossible. And Zechariah's response is one of unbelief. But that same angel goes to Mary, and while she also questions the angel, there is a different feel to it, that it comes from a place of belief, and just asking for clarification, not necessarily saying like, this is impossible, which seemed that way because she was a virgin. And so kind of talking about like, what does it mean to encounter God with belief or unbelief, and how does that affect the way that we receive anything from God? But then somebody else chimed in and talked about how like they were reading that same story, but they were really focused, or they zeroed in on the forced silence of Zechariah. Like he was struck mute. And we had an interesting discussion as to whether or not that also meant that if he was deaf or not during that time as well. And so what does it mean to be silent with God? And how like, Zechariah was forced into silence, but like silence in general is a really hard practice. And how does that practice, like, how does forced silence help our faith? Because it seemed to have helped Zechariah, because when John the Baptist was born, he was able to respond in a different way. Granted, he had the proof, but it was a really interesting discussion, and a really clear example of how multiple people sharing from the same scripture, focusing on different things. It really was like a mini example of dwelling in the Word, it feels like. And then the last example that I want to share was I think just last weekend, where somebody shared from 1 Corinthians, and it was really just yes, this is what I believe, and it makes me want to worship because I believe this is true. And it's where Paul is talking to the Corinthian church, addressing people who in their community who are saying that the resurrection isn't true, like just in general, Jesus or otherwise. And Paul's really like just pinpointing about the fact that Jesus being raised from the dead is an absolute cornerstone of our faith, and that if that is not true, then everything that the church does or believes is in vain. And he even says that we are the most to be pitied. But that Christ has been raised from the dead. Like, it is true. And so really talking about like how just no matter what else is going on in our lives, like we can cling to that truth, because it makes it so our faith is not in vain. And because we know that Christ is alive and that he dwells among us. And that we are his body, and that we are invited into something wonderful. And so those are just a few examples of where people bring scripture saying either like, God, I need you to teach me, or God's changed my perspective on a scripture, and I no longer look at myself with shame, but I look at myself as like beloved by God, or I can stand strong in this truth, or these are the things that I'm learning. And so it really is one of my favorite aspects of